Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. Today, we're heading to New Orleans on December 20th, 1803, the day the United States officially took possession of the Louisiana Territory, completing the Louisiana Purchase. With the stroke of a pen and $15 million, America doubled in size, acquiring 828,000 square miles stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. And here's what I find extraordinary about this moment. This was simultaneously one of the most significant strategic decisions in American history and a massive constitutional overreach that involved selling land that belonged to indigenous peoples who were never consulted. Understanding what happened requires holding multiple truths: that Jefferson's purchase shaped America's future for the better in many ways, and that it was built on questionable constitutional authority and complete disregard for the people who actually lived on that land. Both things are true. Both things matter. Picture this. It's December 20th, 1803 in New Orleans. In the Place d'Armes, what we now call Jackson Square, the French flag is lowered and the American flag is raised. The Louisiana Territory, which France acquired from Spain just 3 years earlier, is now American. William C.C. Claiborne, appointed governor of the territory, takes control. After months of negotiation, treaty ratification, and preparation, the transfer is complete. For $15 million, roughly $340 million in today's money, or about 4 cents an acre, the United States has acquired territory that will eventually become 15 states. It's the most significant land purchase in history. It's a geopolitical masterstroke that removes a European power from the American heartland and gives the young nation room to grow. But here's the thing that I always wonder about. Did Thomas Jefferson, standing in Washington when he received news of the transfer, fully appreciate what he'd done, both the brilliance of it and the troubling aspects? Because this purchase created as many problems as it solved, raised as many questions as it answered, and set precedents that we're still wrestling with today. Let me build the clock for you, because understanding why the Louisiana Purchase happened and what it meant requires examining the strategic situation, the constitutional questions, and most importantly, the people whose land was being bought and sold without their consent. Think about it this way. In 1803, the United States was a young nation, barely 20 years old, clinging to the Atlantic seaboard. The interior of the continent was controlled by indigenous nations who'd lived there for millennia, by Spain in the southwest, and by France, which had just reacquired the Louisiana Territory from Spain. Here's what the evidence tells us. Jefferson was worried. France under Napoleon was expanding aggressively. Having French forces in New Orleans controlling the Mississippi River and access to the Gulf of Mexico threatened American commerce and security. Western farmers depended on shipping their goods down the Mississippi. If France controlled New Orleans, it controlled American economic lifelines. Jefferson's initial goal was modest: to buy New Orleans and perhaps West Florida. He sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to Paris to negotiate. But when they arrived, they found Napoleon in a surprisingly generous mood. He'd lost Haiti in a slave rebellion, was about to resume war with Britain, and needed money. So Napoleon made an offer, not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Territory, all of it, for $15 million. Think about the position Monroe and Livingston were in. They had authorization to spend $10 million for New Orleans. Now they were being offered an area larger than all of America's existing territory for just $5 million more. It was an incredible opportunity, but they had no authority to accept it. Communications took months. They'd have to decide immediately or risk losing the offer. They decided to accept. They exceeded their instructions, bought the entire territory, and sent word back to Jefferson, hoping he'd approve. I find myself thinking about what that took. The courage to make a decision, knowing you're exceeding your authority, betting that the opportunity is too good to pass up, and trusting that your president and Congress will support you. In a world before instant communication, major decisions required that kind of judgment. Jefferson received the news and faced his own dilemma. As someone who believed in strict constitutional interpretation, he knew the Constitution didn't give the federal government power to acquire new territory. He'd spent years arguing that the federal government could only do what the Constitution explicitly authorized. Now he was being asked to approve a purchase that lacked constitutional authority. But here's where pragmatism met principle. Jefferson could see that the purchase was strategically brilliant. It removed European powers from the interior of North America. It gave America room to expand. It secured Mississippi River commerce. It was, in every practical sense, exactly what America needed. So Jefferson did what leaders often do when principle conflicts with pragmatism. He found a way to justify what he wanted to do anyway. He argued that the treaty-making power in the Constitution allowed territorial acquisition. It was a creative constitutional interpretation, to say the least. His Federalist opponents, who usually argued for broad federal powers, suddenly became strict constructionists and objected. The politics were entirely opportunistic on both sides. Congress approved the purchase. The Senate ratified the treaty. And on December 20th, America took possession. It was done. Now here's what I think is crucial, because there's another side to this story that gets much less attention. The Louisiana Territory wasn't empty land. It was home to dozens of indigenous nations, the Osage, Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, and many others. These people had lived there for generations. They had their own governments, their own territorial claims, their own ways of life. And they weren't consulted, not once. France sold land that didn't belong to France. The United States bought land that didn't belong to France. And the people who actually lived there had no voice in the transaction. Think about what that means. Imagine foreign powers negotiating the sale of your home, your land, your territory, and you're not even in the room. You're not asked. Your claims aren't considered. You're simply informed that you now have new overlords. That's what happened to indigenous peoples in the Louisiana Purchase. The evidence shows that Jefferson viewed westward expansion as inevitable and desirable. He believed, as most Americans then believed, that American farmers would eventually settle the land. The rights and claims of indigenous peoples were, at best, obstacles to be overcome and at worst, completely ignored. We're still living with the consequences of the Louisiana Purchase. And I think this is where the story gets especially relevant for us right now. Look at how we think about expansion, about acquisition of territory, about who has legitimate claims to land. The Louisiana Purchase established a pattern. The United States could expand by purchase or forays. Indigenous peoples' claims didn't really matter, and constitutional principles could be stretched when strategic interests demanded it. Here's what fascinates me. We celebrate the Louisiana Purchase as one of Jefferson's most outstanding achievements. It's taught as an unalloyed success, brilliant diplomacy, strategic genius, America's manifest destiny taking shape. But we rarely reckon with what it meant for the people who lived there, the constitutional questions it raised, or the precedent it set for presidential power. Think about it. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the nation without amending the Constitution, without apparent constitutional authority, through an executive branch decision rubber-stamped by Congress. It established that presidents could take dramatic actions that reshaped the country if they could make a case that it served national interests. That precedent echoes through American history. Presidential power has expanded far beyond what the founders envisioned, often justified by strategic necessity. The Louisiana Purchase was an early example of we need to do this, so we'll find a way to justify it constitutionally. The pattern with indigenous peoples established in 1803 continued for the rest of the century. The land we purchased became American through treaties, often coerced, through force, and through the removal of the people who lived there. The Trail of Tears, the Indian Wars, the reservation system, all of this flows from the assumption embedded in the Louisiana Purchase, that this land was America's to claim regardless of who lived there. Here's what troubles me. We still struggle with these questions. When the federal government exercises power not clearly granted in the Constitution, we argue about it unless we like the outcome, in which case we justify it. When indigenous peoples assert treaty rights or land claims, we treat them as obstacles rather than legitimate claims based on prior occupation. The assumptions of 1803 still operate. I find myself thinking about this a lot because I respect every person for who they are, and that includes indigenous peoples whose land was taken, whose treaties were broken, whose rights were ignored. The Louisiana Purchase was a brilliant strategy for American expansion. It was also land theft on a continental scale. Both things are true. Think about the position we're in as a nation. We benefit from the Louisiana Purchase every day. 15 states, critical agricultural land, natural resources, strategic depth, all of it came from that $15 million investment. Should we give it back? That's not practical or possible. But should we acknowledge how we got it? Should we honor the treaty rights of indigenous nations whose territory was included? Should we provide restitution for land taken? These aren't easy questions, but we can't answer them if we keep treating the Louisiana Purchase as an uncomplicated triumph. So, as we think about that December day in 1803, when the American flag was raised in New Orleans and the United States took possession of half a continent, I think the question for us isn't whether the purchase was good or bad. The question is whether we can hold the complexity, brilliant strategy, constitutional overreach, and dispossession of indigenous peoples. All three are true. I respect Jefferson's strategic vision. The Louisiana Purchase secured American independence, enabled westward expansion, and shaped the nation we became. From a purely strategic standpoint, it was brilliant. But I also see the constitutional problems. Jefferson violated his own principles about limited federal government. He set a precedent for expansive presidential power that we're still dealing with. He stretched the Constitution to serve his purposes. And I see the fundamental injustice to indigenous peoples. Their land was sold without their consent. Their claims were ignored. The purchase that we celebrate as a triumph was for them the beginning of a long process of dispossession and forced removal. Here's what troubles me. We teach the Louisiana Purchase as history, a done deal, a triumph, a fait accompli. But for indigenous peoples, it's not just history, it's living injustice. Treaties from that era are still legally binding. Land claims from that period are still being litigated. The consequences are still being felt. Think about what it means to respect every person for who they are. It means respecting the Osage Nation's historical claim to land in the Louisiana Territory. It means respecting the Sioux treaty rights. It means acknowledging that what we call American expansion was from another perspective, invasion and colonization. I always come back to evidence and truth. The evidence shows that the Louisiana Purchase was strategically brilliant for America and catastrophic for indigenous peoples. That's not a contradiction, it's reality. History is full of events that benefited some people while harming others. We honor the complexity by acknowledging both. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And here's why that matters today. The Louisiana Purchase teaches us that we celebrate strategic victories while ignoring their costs, that we justify constitutional overreach when it serves our interests, and that we treat indigenous peoples' claims as obstacles rather than legitimate rights. Yet we keep repeating these patterns, expanding executive power when convenient, dismissing indigenous treaty rights, and celebrating expansion while minimizing dispossession. Suppose we cannot remember that the Louisiana Purchase was simultaneously strategic brilliance and constitutional overreach and massive land theft from indigenous peoples who were never consulted. In that case, we're condemned to keep treating complex historical events as simple triumphs, keep ignoring indigenous rights, and keep justifying ends with questionable means. The question isn't whether we benefited from the Louisiana Purchase. We clearly did. The question is whether we can acknowledge all of its truths, including the uncomfortable ones, and whether we're willing to address the ongoing consequences for indigenous peoples whose land was sold without their consent. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, think about whether you can hold multiple truths about historical events, whether strategic success justifies moral compromise, and what we owe to people whose land was taken to build the nation we enjoy. Because that's what the Louisiana Purchase teaches us, not just about brilliant strategy, but about the costs we're often unwilling to acknowledge. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.